As an initial matter, I would like to thank Utah Valley University for inviting me to speak here. I've had this opportunity in the past, and I want to say it's always a pleasure. And I've looked at the list of speakers you've had over this past week, and it's really quite a remarkable list, and I think quite a testament to the university that it runs the gamut of thinkers that it does and gives you the opportunity to pick and choose from this broad spectrum of interesting speakers. Marxism is the unifying theme in this group, but I'm going to be coming at it from a somewhat different standpoint. Whereas Jason was talking about Marx himself, I'm going to speak about a tradition out of which I come, and one in which I think has lost the Marxian moment. So I'm going to be looking at it from a somewhat different standpoint, namely the standpoint of a group of thinkers called the Frankfurt School, which I believe has not kept the initial neo-Marxian impulse that motivated the formation of the school back in the 1920s, and I think that it has suffered for it. So I'm going to analyze the movement of their thought from the standpoint of the loss of the critique of capitalism. The way I'm going to present is I'm going to offer about a 10-minute introduction into the Frankfurt School itself, because I'm fairly comfortable with the notion that many of you really haven't dealt with this school. It's fairly arcane. So I want to give you a sense of where they're coming from. And then at that point, I want to narrow in on the movement of the Frankfurt School itself in terms of its understanding of the relationship between capitalism, normativity, and broadly speaking, the question of praxis. And my contention, in essence, is that by virtue of losing the critique of capitalism, it has distorted their philosophizing, not just in terms of the social theory, but with respect to normative questions that they otherwise take to, which otherwise motivate their thought. And hopefully this will come out through the talk. So let me begin then. Over the past 80 years, the Institute for Social Research, or as it is more commonly known, the Frankfurt School, has been run by 3 generations of German social philosophers attempting to formulate a critical theory of contemporary society. As one might well imagine, the Frankfurt School's research program has changed a number of times over these past 80 years, but there are shared commitments that span the generations. These commitments form an indispensable part of the Frankfurt School's distinctive methodological approach, which is best known as critical theory. As an initial matter, the social philosophers of the Frankfurt School are all committed to investigating the developing relationship between the ideals of philosophy and the facts of the social sciences, and all more or less share the following view. When philosophy is severed from the social sciences, it furnishes utopian ideals that do not take into consideration their own social foundations. And when the social sciences are severed from philosophy, they furnish facts that are taken to be natural rather than the result of social processes informed by normative assumptions. Furthermore, as this suggests, the social philosophers of the Frankfurt School are all committed to a painstakingly historical philosophical approach. They acutely recognize that the standpoint from which they formulate their own theories of contemporary society is tethered to the existing social landscape, which means that they must consider not only how society changes over time, but also how their own standpoint of critique changes along with it. The theoretical approach is thus inexorably self-reflective, and in this sense, it is critical. When Horkheimer first formulated the term critical theory in 1937, he also intended critical to refer to the idea that social philosophy must be informed by a vision of the future to be made good, which meant for him nothing less than the emancipation of humanity itself. With Adorno and Marcuse, Horkheimer embraced a Hegelian Marxist philosophy of history, and he believed that a classless society continued to be an objective possibility, despite the fact that the German working classes were moving toward fascism instead of socialism. It is for this reason that he did not see his position as utopian. Instead, Horkheimer believed that because the emancipation of humanity continued to be an objective historical possibility, it was the function of social philosophy to keep this possibility alive in the face of these countervailing tendencies. However, when subsequently confronted with the horrors of Nazism and Soviet communism, as well as the seeming ability of American capital to pacify its working classes, the first generation of the Frankfurt School turned its energies toward ideology critique, which seeks to explain why the working classes continue to support social arrangements that are not in their own interest. While many empirical analyses were provided, the overarching thesis was that reason itself contained a regressive moment that cut against humanity's interest in emancipation. Drawing on Weber's theory of purposive rationality, Horkheimer and Adorno contended that the Enlightenment itself, while containing the kernels of emancipation, tended instead to promote instrumental rationality, and that its unfolding logic, which found full expression in late capitalism, culminated in what Weber called the iron cage of rationality. This phase of critical theory ran roughly from the 1930s through the late 1960s, and with the noteworthy exception of a couple of works produced by Marcuse during the time when the New Left was ascendant, it essentially constituted the first generation's concluding research program. Since that time, critical theory's commitment to the ideal of human emancipation has waxed and waned. In his earlier writings, Habermas, the leader of the Frankfurt School's second generation, maintained that social philosophy must be undertaken with a critical intent, and he attempted to rehabilitate Horkheimer's earlier program along the lines of an immanent critique of epistemology. However, as time passed and Habermas's own research program shifted toward a theory of communication concerned with the formal structures underlying undistorted speech, he abandoned the emancipatory moment altogether and spoke instead of the exhaustion of utopian energies. This change in Habermas's research program, which took place sometime in the mid-1970s, was itself motivated by considerations not unlike those that had confronted the Frankfurt School's first generation. In 1966, Adorno contended that not only had philosophy's ideals been socio-historically thwarted, given that there was no longer an emancipatory social movement that had the potential to realize them, but also that reason itself had become wholly instrumentalized, and thus it was not even possible to indicate the kinds of ideals that might fill the normative void. Beyond the methodological question of Adorno's own standpoint of critique, given his view that society itself had become totally administered, Habermas contends that Adorno does not provide the means to explain what the social and individual costs of the instrumentalization of reason actually amount to. In other words, not only was Adorno unable to find a socio-historically situated standpoint of resistance from which the ideals of philosophy might be brought about, but he was unable to indicate what these ideals might actually look like. In response, Habermas effectively severs normativity from resistance in a bid to make good the former at the expense of the latter. To accomplish this task, he differentiates both reason and the social sphere and holds that while instrumental reason applies to what he calls the system, which deals with economic and administrative concerns, communicative reason applies to the life world, which should generate norms and values in conformity with the force of the better argument. Habermas readily concedes that the imperatives of the system have, in his words, colonized the life world, and he thinks that he can point to the ideal situation, the ideal speech situation, as a regulative ideal that suggests what has been lost normatively. But he sees no reason to believe that this ideal might be realized. Thus, building on his earlier claim about the exhaustion of utopian energies, Habermas recently stated that the idea that there is a tendency toward emancipation in human history constitutes a form of argumentation that belongs unambiguously to the past. In recent years, Honneth, the leader of the third generation of critical theory, has attempted to reinvigorate critical theory by reintegrating the ideal of human emancipation. Shifting the locus of critical theory from both the formal proceduralism and transcendentalism of Habermas's neo-Kantian linguistic turn to a variation of neo-Hegelianism that is characterized by materiality and immanence, Honneth links back up, albeit in a qualified way, with the first-generation philosophers of the Frankfurt School. Fleshing out Hegel's theory of recognition with recent empirical work in sociology and psychology, Honneth contends that critical theory's normative core is now to be found in contemporary social struggles for recognition. In this way, he intends to go beyond a form of critical theory that had contented itself with splitting off its normative foundations from existing social conflicts. It is Hannah's view that this transition is justified by the fact that over the past few decades, emerging social movements have revolved around multicultural issues, and this evinces in his eyes the fact that the politics of identity, spurred by feelings of disrespect, has basically supplanted the politics of class, which was spurred in part, or at least by Hannah's lights, by maldistribution. Furthermore, Hannah argues, recognition should be understood as the umbrella under which all normative claims must be understood, and therefore he maintains that even questions of economic maldistribution must be understood in terms of insufficient recognition. By virtue of this unified framework, which no longer separates the question of capitalism from critical theory's normative core, Hannah claims to be in a position to reintegrate the issue of capitalism into critical theory, albeit within the larger recognitive framework that he offers. As a result, in 2007, Hannah launched a new comprehensive research project for the Frankfurt School that was titled Paradoxes of Capitalist Modernization. In setting out the research agenda at the general level, Hannah credits neoliberal capitalism with undeniable moral, legal, and material progress, but goes on to claim that this very same progress has also increased the number of people who are unable to take advantage of this normative progress due to insufficient resources. As this brief introduction has suggested, critical theory has changed its position on the nature of capitalism a number of times throughout its history. In what follows, I will trace this movement in a critical fashion, with particular emphasis on how its evolving perspective on capitalism has affected its positions on normativity and praxis. In my view, critical theory's rejection of the critique of capitalism writ large has had a negative effect on the way in which it approaches questions of both normativity and praxis. And it seems to me that given the economic crisis through which we are now living, critical theory must reconceive its relationship to capitalism to maintain, not only to maintain some sort of fealty to the original spirit that had spurred the critical theory movement in the 1930s, but in fact to remain viable. Because it seems to me that from Hannah through Habermas, it has veered off course. So let me now begin to look at the relationship between the evolving relationship between critical theory's account of the relationship between capitalism on the one hand and questions of normativity and praxis on the other. Critical theory's analysis of political economy by my lights has been deficient since the 1940s. And although its most important contributions clearly lie elsewhere, many of these contributions are based on this deficiency and therefore must be reconsidered in this light. In his highly influential essay, State Capitalism, Its Possibilities and Limitations, which was first published in 1941, Friedrich Pollock contends that the rise of monopolies or oligopolies in the major economic sectors, coupled with a growing and increasingly interventionist state, indicates that capitalism's liberal period is on the way out, and he characterizes the emerging economic form as state capitalism. Whether in its totalitarian or democratic form, state capitalism deposes the market from its controlling function in coordinating both production and distribution, thereby causing the classical economic laws to disappear, and it vests these functions in the state, which sets up pseudo-markets to regulate and expand production and coordinate it with consumption. In effect, Pollock claims that economic conflicts and crises have become political conflicts and crises, and that whenever such conflicts or crises arise, they will be taken up in an administrative fashion, which further consolidates state control. As he concisely puts it, the profit motive is superseded by the power motive, and this means that the laws of the liberal market, which were the basis for Marx's crisis theory, are also superseded by Pollock's lights. Pollock did concede the possibility that political antagonisms, such as contradictory interests within the ruling classes, might undermine state capitalism, but this observation did not leave much room for the possibility of meaningful resistance on the part of those who might be subject to state capitalism's regime. For this reason, a colleague at the Frankfurt School, Franz Neumann, argued the state capitalist thesis would give rise to utter hopelessness and betoken the end of a genuine critical theory. In Behemoth, which was published in 1942, Neumann contends that the very term state capitalism is a contradiction in terms. Although tackling the German economy in particular, Neumann also considers broader issues in political economy. And while he admits that a form of state-bolstered monopoly capitalism is becoming increasingly prevalent, he contends that profits continue to be the motivating force. On the whole, what is most commendable about Neumann's analysis is not only that he balances economic and political considerations instead of cashing out one way or the other, but that he reaches his conclusions by plowing through the data instead of doing an end run on it. On the basis of well-documented analyses of general trends with respect to economic concerns, namely the promotion of cartels, industrial organization, price controls in the market, investment and profits, foreign trade and imperialism, and internal labor policies, and also by considering political concerns, namely the dynamics of bureaucracy, the party hierarchy, the civil service, armed forces, and particularly the working classes, Neumann rejects the claims that prices and wages are administrative, that the law of value is no longer operative, and that the appropriation of labor is a political act, not an economic one. Moreover, in response to Pollock's acknowledgement that state capitalism is to be viewed as a model in the sense that Weber referred to an ideal type, Neumann maintains that Pollock's thesis violates the principle that the model or ideal type must be derived from reality and must not transcend it. The essence of Neumann's complaint is that while the proponents of state capitalism admitted that Germany still had many of the attributes of the classical capitalist form, they disregarded these attributes when they contended that reality is quickly approaching the state capitalist model, and therefore they also failed to do the empirical work that was required to justify the model's instantiation, even as a future possibility. As Neumann puts it, they cannot merely point to trends within capitalism in order to show that these trends must necessarily beget a system of power politics without economics, but they have to prove their case for each of the systems concerned. It was Pollock's position, not Neumann's, that was adopted by the philosophers of the first generation, and this had no small bearing on the subsequent development of critical theory. Most proximately, with the adoption of the state capitalist thesis, the theoretical grounding for the transition to the critique of instrumental reason was established. Capitalism itself increasingly came to be viewed as only a moment within a larger historical movement marked by the ascendance of instrumental rationality, which becomes increasingly regressive when Enlightenment rationality cannot ground itself in the wake of its disenchantment of the world. The conclusion of this historical movement is perhaps best captured by Adorno's notion of the totally administered society. Yet crucially, in contrast to critical theory's second and third generations, the first generation did not abandon the critique of capitalism altogether. Even Adorno, who was the first generation philosopher most often associated with the critique of instrumental reason, continued to attack the capitalist system in the name of human emancipation. In his sociological works in particular, Adorno opposes the tendency to reduce capitalism to instrumental rationality, but instead attempts to mediate these two phenomena by way of Marx's two fundamental categories, the forces of production and the relations of production. For Adorno, industrial society, which spans all of the advanced political systems and is characterized by the unremitting march of instrumental or technological rationality, is linked with the forces of production. Capitalist society, which is characterized by a certain configuration of social relationships, is linked with the relations of production. And it is in their mutual reinforcement, according to Adorno, that the totally administered society comes to fruition. As a result, Adorno declares, it is not technology that is fatal, but the fact that it gets matted together with social relations that surround it. Although, on the flip side, he also acknowledges that these inegalitarian social relations can only actualize the totalitarian form that they do by virtue of this technological development. So the notion of instrumental rationality and capitalism are mutually reinforcing rather than simply reject the notion of the critique of capitalism in favor of a critique of instrumental rationality, Adorno mediates the relationship of the two, but because he sees them as interrelating in this relatively seamless fashion, he tends toward the despair that leads him to posit the notion of the totally administered society. The problem here is, I think, in part that Adorno is relying on the ideal type or model that had been proffered by Pollock. And the problem with such models is that they tend to provide a static model of society rather than a more dynamic Marxian model that would root social trends within existing social relations and social struggles. Because there are no analyses of the contradictions, tendencies, and struggles that might lead the society to go beyond capitalism in Pollock's theory of state capitalism, Adorno was reduced to holding out the emancipatory ideal in a largely utilitarian fashion. And in this way, he arguably fell short of critical theory's own methodological strictures. To reductively afford primacy to the political, in short, not only undercuts the goal of an interdisciplinary approach that seeks a comprehensive theory of society, but it also undercuts the commitment to the political itself. By leaving it inadequately mediated and thus insufficiently concrete, an ideal type that affords primacy to the political does not provide a determinate basis for praxis or resistance at all. Now, when confronted with the legacy of the first generation, Habermas had some fairly basic concerns, and these roughly correspond to the problem of locating normativity and resistance in critical theory. For Habermas, although Adorno's negative dialectics held open both the conceptual standpoint for its own critique and the ideal of human emancipation, Habermas claims it had no basis for doing so. According to Habermas, Adorno's negative dialectic suffered from at least three problems. First, it could not articulate the grounds for its own deployment of non-instrumental reason, given the hegemony of instrumental reason within what Adorno called the totally administered society. Second, it could not point to those social forces that might bring the emancipatory ideal to fruition, given the foiled Hegelian Marxist philosophy of history that, albeit in modified form, continued to be its underpinning. And third, and from Habermas' standpoint most troubling of all, it could not articulate those ideals that the totally administered society was suppressing, given that on a Hegelian Marxist philosophy of history, norms are socio-historically engendered and thus merely reflect the social structure out of which they grow. Habermas's evolving philosophy reflected his attempt to deal with these problems, but as is so often the case, in attempting to deal with some problems, he lost track of others. And by my lights, what he lost track of was the critique of capitalism itself, which seemed to me to underlie all of the other problems with which Habermas is now going to attempt to deal. I shall attempt to address this momentarily, but in the meantime, I would like to briefly look at an important, albeit transitional essay in which one can glimpse the possibility of at least a somewhat better path for Habermas's philosophizing. In the mid-1970s, after Habermas rejected the speculative idea at the heart of knowledge and human interests, namely that humanity has an innate emancipatory interest, but before he fully embraced the system's theoretic commitments manifested in the theory of communicative action, he published a number of articles considering the possibility of reconstructing Marx's idea of historical materialism. As a general matter, the representation of his project is somewhat of a misnomer, for what Habermas is really attempting to do is justify his emerging theory of communicative action along anthropological lines. In particular, he contends that while his theory of communication is intended to solve philosophical problems, it must be comprehended in terms of a larger theory of social evolution, which is rooted in the development of societal learning processes. I do not find this feature of what Habermas is doing particularly compelling, but what I do find interesting is the way in which he frames the larger relationship between the development of societal learning processes, which he believes are manifested in morality, law, and communicative action, and the development of society's productive capacities. In the seminal essay, Historical Materialism and the Development of Normative Structures, Habermas maintains, and I quote, that in its developmental dynamics, the change of normative structures remains dependent on the evolutionary challenges posed by unresolved, economically conditioned systems problems and on learning processes that are a response to them. And in this regard, I think that he is right. Put somewhat differently, he is reaffirming here the idea that while economic and cultural matters dialectically interpenetrate one another, economic matters are in some sense primary, or as Habermas says, quote, culture remains a superstructural phenomenon. This is more or less the position that of the first generation critical theorists. Moreover, Habermas maintains that there had always been a lack of clarity concerning Marxism's normative foundations, but he claims that this shortcoming was able to remain in the background because Marxism could imminently critique bourgeois ethics. And in some sense, I think that Habermas is right here as well. But in the face of Marxism's crisis theory, Habermas continues, the capitalist class has been able to stabilize its position, and with this, bourgeois consciousness has become cynical, which means that, according to Habermas, there are no longer any immanent norms to which an immanent critique of capitalism could appeal. As a result, he claims, a philosophical ethics is possible, and this is really the nub of the Habermasian term, I quote, only if we can reconstruct general presuppositions of communication and procedures for justifying norms and values. There is a good deal to pick apart here. As an initial matter, it should be noted, by the mid-1970s, the New Left had faded, and the capitalist classes in the West had already begun to reconstitute their rule on a sounder footing. What was not clear at this time was that the capitalist classes were in the process of bolstering their position by incorporating student and worker demands into the capitalist framework, albeit in a substantively neutralized form, and that this phenomenon, conjoined with an increase in international competition and the decline of American economic hegemony, portended the replacement of the neo-Keynesian welfare state by a neoliberal capitalist regime. As Habermas understood it, however, the neo-Keynesian welfare state had been more or less stabilized, which was Habermas's mistake at the time, and this presupposition, in my view, strongly impacted the sociological account he provided in the second volume of The Theory of Communicative Action, which was published in 1981. Much as was the case with Pollock's State Capitalism, which sets forth state capitalism as an ideal type, Habermas's characterization of the welfare state is less a reflection of the changes that were really going on than an ideal typical account that was already in the process of being replaced. In the second volume of The Theory of Communicative Action, System and Life World, Habermas specifies the democratic welfare state as the current stage, and the major problem he discerns is a trend toward the juridification of the life world. This trend manifests an underlying tension between the administration of benefits to an expanding class of citizens, qua clients, and a diminution of freedom for these citizens, for these clients, qua citizens. This duality, in a nutshell, reflects the large duality of system and life world, which for Habermas constitute the basic sociological categories through which contemporary society ought to be understood. From the contemporary standpoint, when citizens have less in the way of both benefits and freedom, Habermas's analysis seems rather quaint. Habermas can be forgiven his failure to recognize the developing nature of capitalism, for he was certainly not alone in this regard. In the late 1970s, the basic structural changes that were underway, which were laying the groundwork for neoliberal capitalism, or what has been called the new spirit of capitalism, were barely discernible. The problem instead is that Habermas's formulation of the relationship between system and life world evidenced a sociological tendency to see the socio-historical landscape in terms of Daniel Bell's end of ideology, which Habermas mentions favorably in The Theory of Communicative Action. Although Habermas takes Adorno to task for seeing the socio-historical landscape in terms of the triumph of instrumental reason, he tacitly does the very same thing And what is worse, he does it under the cover of a social ontology. Adorno, it will be remembered, associated industrial society with the forces of production and capitalist society with the relations of production, and he attempted to mediate the relationship between the two. Or, in what amounts to the very same thing, he sought to mediate the relationship between technological reason, which is inherently positivistic, and the entire spectrum of social relations under capitalism, which are not inherently positivistic, but only appear that way because capital seeks to petrify them for ideological reasons. They become, in essence, second nature. In sharp contrast, by setting off the system as the domain of material reproduction, in which both technology and social relations ought to be subject to the logic of instrumental reason, Habermas collapses the difference between the forces of production and the relations of production, and in this way he petrifies social relations in the same manner as capitalist ideology attempts to do. Of course, Habermas holds that communicative reason, which underlies the logic of the life world, is what ought to be generating our norms and values, and that these norms and values ought to be governing social relations outside the sphere of reproduction. But social relations do not function in this bifurcated way that Habermas's account suggests that they should, and the fact that capitalist social relations have come to colonize the life world, as Habermas describes it, should come as no surprise. Although he reconstructs Weber's thought and otherwise draws on sociologists such as Durkheim and Parsons to open up new possibilities for reason, Habermas's theory nevertheless seems to lead to a conclusion that is not unlike Weber's dire prognosis concerning the iron cage of rationality. As Habermas puts it, the colonization of the life world is the irresistible irony of the world historical process of enlightenment. If Habermas had not overemphasized Weber at the expense of Marx, he might have detected in the latter certain theoretical resources that might have led him to a different conclusion. In particular, Marx did not believe that the imperatives of production demand a particular organization of social labor, as Habermas's analysis assumes, but rather that the organization of social labor is a manifestation of a particular set of social relations in which the dominant class interprets the imperatives of production in terms of its own interests and then implements this accordingly. The way in which both social labor within the sphere of production and social relations within the life world have been transformed under the rule of neoliberal capitalism amply testifies to this fact. Indeed, as the sociologist Eva Illouz indicates, it is a communicative ethic marked by the rationalization of communication that is now the spirit of the corporation, which is at the system's core. While there can be little doubt that the system has instrumentalized the communicative ethic associated While there can be little doubt that the system has instrumentalized the communicative ethic associated with Habermas, this does indicate that the system is not merely a norm-free block of sociality, as Habermas contends. Rather, it shows that system and life world dialectically inform one another, which is just the conclusion that Habermas sought to avoid when he turned system and life world into the social equivalent of a substantial dualism. Habermas's theory of communicative action thus runs into practically the same problem that he attributes to Adorno's negative dialectics. It is a small step from Adorno's claim that whatever norms or values might be articulated are overdetermined by an instrumental reason that is homologous with and in the service of commodity exchange under capitalism, to Habermas's claim that communicative rationality, which is the basis of the life world's norms and values, are themselves colonized by this instrumental reason that has escaped its appropriate domain in the system. Of course, Habermas thinks that his theory of communicative action is shielded against the charge that he had brought against Adorno's critique of instrumental reason. With his ideal speech situation, he was able to articulate, at least in theory, the normative costs of the life world's instrumentalization. But in fact, it is not at all clear to me that Habermas is even entitled to this philosophical consolation, since a critical theory of society cannot content itself with normative structures that are devoid of content, as is the case with the formal presuppositions that underlie Habermas's ideal speech situation. Or to put the matter somewhat differently, corresponding to Habermas's sociological deficit, there is also a normative deficit. As Hegel argued with respect to the Kantian morality, the content of particular interests, which constitute the backdrop against which an abstract universal morality frames its duties, tend to be presupposed by this morality in the very process through which it purports to abstract from them. Ironically, such a conclusion might be acceptable to Kant if all that he's attempting to do is test the laws as he finds them. To put the matter in terms of Hegel's criticism of Kant, it might not concern Kant that maxims presupposing both the existence and the non-existence of property can pass the test of the categorical imperative, provided that there are at least some maxims, such as those involving a lying promise, that cannot pass the test of the categorical imperative, irrespective of the backdrop against which the maxim is formulated. This privileging a form of over content, or in what amounts to the same thing, this indifference to content, is not something that should be acceptable to a critical theorist, however. Now, Habermas would rightly claim that his theory of communicative action does not split form and content in this way. Unlike Kant's moral philosophy, in which the content that comes through the maxims formulation is tested by the categorical imperative for the purpose of determining whether it can assume a universal form, the content that is brought to the table by the communicative participant need not assume a universal form. Instead, it must be acceptable to other participants on the basis of the force of the better argument. On Habermas's account, in other words, the test of the content of particular interests is not whether they can take on a universal form, which permits too many maxims and therefore sanitizes too much content, but whether others can be persuaded to accept the content of these particular interests in accord with the universal pragmatic presuppositions that are implicit in communicative action. But as this suggests, the original problem only replays itself at a deeper level. It is not that the content must meet a universal form, but rather that if the universal pragmatic presuppositions of the ideal speech situation are met, then any content can be deemed normatively valid. Given Habermas's concern that the life world has been instrumentalized by the system, which means that the content of the life world reflects the system's economic and administrative imperatives, these imperatives would likely meet with assent in an ideal speech situation and thus receive its normative gloss. Or simply, to put it much more simply, right, the notion here is contra Kant, even though all the participants in communication can bring their own interests and concerns to the table, right, they don't need to abstract from them in the way Kant argued they should. What ultimately happens is they all might, through the ideal speech situation, reach a particular sort of consensus, but a particular sort of consensus that we ourselves would not want to accept as normatively valid. And the reason for this is the abstraction of the ideal speech situation as Habermas offers. So at this point, the problems with which the first generation of critical theory were most concerned come directly to the forefront. Under these conditions in which communicative participants are inclined to normatively affirm a set of political economic arrangements that may cut against their very own interests, the related problems of ideology and false consciousness arise. Habermas acknowledges these problems, but he maintains that in this post-ideological period, which is marked by a proliferation of information that can no longer be understood in ideological terms, consciousness loses its ability to synthesize and thereby becomes fragmented. Thus, according to Habermas, in place of false consciousness, we today have a fragmented consciousness that blocks enlightenment by the mechanism of reification. It is only with this that the conditions for a colonization of the life world are met, or so Habermas claims. Rather than serving the critique of ideology, Habermas continues, A critical analysis would have to explain the cultural impoverishment and fragmentation of everyday consciousness and examine the conditions for recoupling a rationalized culture with an everyday communication dependent on vital traditions. Although Habermas is undoubtedly right when he asserts that today's consciousness is fragmented, and indeed this is truer now than when Habermas wrote these words, his claim that a fragmented consciousness replaces the notion of false consciousness, and thus the critique of ideology, is a troubling one. The fact of a fragmented consciousness does not preclude the possibility of a false consciousness, but instead fuels it. And the notion that ideology has ended only arises from Habermas's idiosyncratic claim that when left to its own internal logics, system and life world will unfold in a post-ideological fashion. But as I previously suggested, Habermas's notion that capitalist relations of production are invariant and can be separated from the social relations that underlie the life world is itself a piece of ideology, and the idea that there are still viable, vital traditions that might resurrect an instrumentalized life world is profoundly suspect. Well before their instrumentalization, many of these vital traditions fought against emancipatory moments every bit as much as they fought against the process of liberal rationalization that culminates in the life world's colonization. And after the life world's colonization, these vital traditions have themselves been transformed by systemic imperatives. Habermas's hope of recoupling a rationalized culture with an everyday communication dependent on vital traditions is in sum a deeply undialectical notion. Honneth was one of the first to point out that Habermas's developing corpus in the 1970s had come to constitute a paradigm shift within critical theory. As Honneth put it, the guiding question for Habermas was how critical theory might throw off its defensive posture, and what interested him was the way in which Habermas's approach revitalized the role of sociology in critical theory. I quote Honneth now. No longer pursuing the critique of ideology, but rather hoping for theoretical advance, critical theory has now engaged itself with the classical tradition of sociology. A few years after the publication of the Theory of Communicative Action, however, Honneth contended that Habermas's social ontology did not do justice to the potential inherent in his communicative paradigm, and therefore his theory of communicative action was not up to the task of extricating critical theory from the problems that Habermas himself had diagnosed in Adorno's thought. The heart of the problem, according to Honneth, was that although Habermas had entertained the possibility of a social model that was based on the idea of a moral consensus formation encompassing all of society and organizing all domains of action, he mistakenly took up a social model in which the substantial dualism of system and life world was offered. Honneth's theory of recognition, in no small part, seeks to express the intuitions underlying the path not taken. Just as Hegel's ethical theory aims to go beyond the dualities innate to Marx's moral philosophy by relocating both normativity and the impetus for its development in the movement of history, Honneth's neo-Hegelian theory of recognition aims to go beyond the dualities that are intrinsic to Habermas's neo-Kantian theory of communicative action. In particular, Honneth reunifies the social totality such that all social domains are subject to normative imperatives, and he liberates critical theory's normative core from its imprisonment in the formal presuppositions of communicative action and inserts it into contemporary social struggles. As Honneth properly says, critical theory in its innermost core is dependent upon a quasi-sociological specification of an emancipatory interest in social reality itself. And for Honneth, this emancipatory interest is to be found in social struggles for recognition. As he put it in regard to Habermas well over 30 years ago, Honneth now seeks to throw off critical theory's defensive posture. There are many angles from which Honneth's theory of recognition might be considered, but what concerns me here is the following. As he suggested over 30 years ago with respect to Habermas's thought, Honneth thinks that the critique of ideology, which was closely related with the idea of capitalist hegemony, had impeded the development of critical theory, and that it was up to sociology to fill the theoretical gap. Even as Hunneth rejects other features of Habermas's thought, he embraces Habermas's claim that normative structures are engendered in the cultural sphere, and he contends that these structures are what facilitate changes in the economic sphere. Consequently, rather than grant priority to the economic base over the cultural superstructure, as orthodox Marxism had done, Hunneth holds that normative questions that arise under capitalism, such as economic redistribution, should be subsumed under a sufficiently differentiated theory of recognition. Hunneth thus proposes what he calls a normative monism of recognition. Now, until recently, Hunneth seemed to take for granted the idea that the struggles for recognition that popped up on empirical sociology's radar screen, whether emanating in the economic or cultural sphere, more or less adequately captured the normative deficits in contemporary society, though he did concede that there might be situations in which the subordinated might not even have the wherewithal to make their feelings of disrespect heard. In keeping with his rejection of ideology critique, what Hunneth did not consider was the possibility that the concept of recognition itself might be ideologically appropriated, which is to say that by virtue of socio-cultural conditioning, the subordinated might identify with their roles and therefore would have no impulse to struggle against them. In a recent essay entitled Recognition as Ideology, however, he finally takes up this question. After outlining Hunneth's position, I shall analyze how it bears on the questions of normativity and resistance within his recognitive theory, and finally, how his recognitive theory misrepresents its normative and emancipatory potential by the way it positions itself with respect to the critique of capitalism. In Recognition as Ideology, Hunneth acknowledges that while recognition has always been treated as representing the opposite of practices of domination or subjection, and thus has enjoyed a presumption of innocence, it is now understood there is the possibility that it can also operate as a conformist ideology. The problem, of course, is to distinguish between forms of recognition that are ideological, and by ideological I mean in the pejorative sense, and forms of recognition that are correct and morally justified. For a neo-Hegelian like Hunneth, distinguishing between these two forms of recognition at any particular historical moment is especially daunting, given that the criteria for determining the appropriateness of recognition unfolds historically. But even if the issue is limited to the present, it is extremely difficult to distinguish between ideological and justified forms of recognition in any reasonable way without empirical evidence, which is generally manifested in social struggles for recognition. Hunneth sets forth 4 premises that a form of recognition must meet to be morally justified, all of which aim to facilitate the ability of the recognized person to identify his or her own qualities and achieve a greater degree of autonomy. In this way, Hunneth believes he holds open a non-ideological understanding of recognition, but of course he comes no closer to providing criteria that would indicate when this form of recognition has been achieved. Hunneth begins to address the problem when he declares that his recognitive model presupposes a moderate form of value realism, which he thinks is underwritten by a robust conception of historical progress. As was the case with Habermas, historical progress here does not refer to the Hegelian Marxist philosophy of history, which both continue to reject, but instead to the historical development of human learning processes. For Hunneth, the expansion of these learning processes manifest themselves in the expansion of recognition, and in this way, recognition becomes more rational and more morally justified. Of course, even ideological forms of recognition have a rational component, as Hunneth concedes when he points to the fact that they also operate within a historical space of reasons. But although rational, ideological forms of recognition do not close the gap between their evaluative promise and the material fulfillment of that promise. And it is here, according to Hunneth, that we have the criterion for determining when recognition is merely ideological and when it is correct and morally justified. To show how this criterion, the gap between the evaluative promise and its material fulfillment, is to be employed for determining whether a form of recognition is ideological or morally justified, Hunneth uses an example that is especially fortuitous for my current purposes. Hunneth correctly points out that under neoliberal capitalism, there has been a major change in the way that employees have been addressed. No longer merely workers or wage earners, the employees of today are associates and creative entrepreneurs, which is meant to suggest that they have a greater degree of autonomy in carrying out their functions and can expect greater job fulfillment. In considering whether this new form of recognition is ideological, Hunneth points to the fact that employees are often required to fake initiative, flexibility, and talents in places where there are no roots for such values, and this shows that while the new form of recognition is rational, given the way in which it appeals to its employees, it is also ideological because it does not furnish the basis for its own material fulfillment. Evidencing his continued distrust of ideology critique, Hunneth warns that this must not lead us astray into a hermeneutics of suspicion that is all too certain of itself, for it may be the case that there is just a time lag between the evaluative promise and the ability of the relevant social institutions to provide the basis for bringing it to its material fulfillment. What should be noticed here as an initial matter is that Hunneth does not raise the issue of financial compensation, notwithstanding the fact that during the reign of neoliberal capitalism, there has been a massive redistribution of income and wealth to the upper classes, who have used their mounting resources to further accelerate this redistributive process. It would appear that by material fulfillment, Hunneth does not mean material fulfillment, if by this we mean distributive justice in any sense of the term. To be fair, Hunneth does address the issue of redistribution in his book, Redistribution or Recognition, in which he and Nancy Fraser engage in a political-philosophical dialogue. And to make his position clear, it is necessary to spell out his theory in a somewhat greater detail. For Hunneth, our interpersonal relationships can be understood in terms of three central attitudes: mutual affection and concern, or love, quite simply; legal relations that are based on equal rights, or equality in the formal sense; and competitive relations that are based on abilities and talents, or what we might call the achievement principle. And he holds that a positive self-relation demands the appropriate recognition in each one of these spheres. Now, it is Hunneth's contention that financial compensation falls under the achievement principle, which means that the failure to appropriately compensate a class of workers for their achievements is tantamount to refusing to appropriately recognize them and is therefore morally unjustified. Hunneth concedes that the criteria for determining exactly what it means to meet the requirements of recognition in each of these three spheres changes over time, but he claims that the capitalist order has evinced progress in terms of expanding the recognitive requirements in these spheres, and moreover, that its potential has not yet been exhausted. Thus, he claims that the capitalist social order has come a long way to bringing the legal principle of equality to fruition, and that while the achievement principle has not shown the same progress in enlarging its internal recognition in principle, it still possesses, as Hunneth puts it, a surplus of validity, which means it still contains rooms for those affected to raise recognitive claims in support of expanding its boundaries, thus justifying greater compensation on moral grounds. In sum, then, for Hunneth, struggles for greater compensation are to be interpreted as, and now I quote, definitional conflicts over the legitimacy of the current application of the achievement principle, end quote. Hunneth's argument here is deeply flawed, and in a number of ways. To begin with, however, I should point out that I agree in some sense with Habermas and Hunneth to the extent that they contend that the normative foundations of Marx's views are not sufficiently worked out, or at least in the later works. For at least in terms of the later works, it is clear that Marx not only sees no reason to consider such issues, but also thinks that the consideration of such issues, ethics, morality, is counterproductive. I am somewhat inclined to agree with those who argue that Marx succumbed to the scientistic presuppositions of his age, but even if this is not the case, it is fairly clear at this historical juncture that we have no reason to assume that history is going to work itself out in such a way as to realize the aim of human emancipation, and we have no reason to assume this even if capitalism does crumble under its own weight. At a minimum, in my view, ethical arguments must be made with respect to the normative deficits of the capitalist system, and there are many. And it seems to me that this is so even as capitalism progressively manifests its own functional deficits. Nevertheless, when I consider Hunneth's assertion that capitalism's achievement principle is up to the task of diagnosing and rectifying problems of maldistribution, not to mention the problems of alienation and exploitation, Marx's old contention that normative considerations are fundamentally ideological doesn't look so bad. Consider, for example, Hunneth's claim that because capitalism was able to expand the boundaries of capitalism's legal principle, the principle of formal equality, there is no reason to believe that it cannot expand the boundaries of capitalism's achievement principle, which still allegedly possess a surplus of validity. While Hunneth is right about the equality principle, his conclusion in regard to the achievement principle does not follow. It should be understood that an expansion of the legal principle of formal equality was absolutely consistent with the inner dynamics of the capitalist system. In fact, to use Hegel's terminology, it was necessary, the realization of formal equality in order for capitalism to make itself adequate to its own concept. Discrimination and other remnants of the pre-modern attitude interfere with the ability of capitalism to exploit its opportunities for accumulation, a fact that Marx was abundantly clear on in the mid-1800s. Conversely, an expansion of the achievement principle, which would link up the failure to properly compensate, however that may be determined, with a failure to recognize, is absolutely inconsistent with capitalism's internal dynamics. Hunneth carelessly assumes that there is no contradiction between the drive to increase profits and the drive for recognition under the achievement principle, but this is patently untrue, as is evidenced by the fact that real wages have either stagnated or fallen throughout the neoliberal capitalist period, the same period during which workers have come to be seen as associates and creative entrepreneurs. Hunneth may have some basis for believing there is a surplus of validity with respect to the achievement principle under neoliberal capitalism, but if he does, it is not grounded empirically, and he is unable to point to it. Under the rule of neoliberal capitalism, not only has the achievement principle actually contracted, but so has the equality principle, which had reached its zenith under the welfare state. Even if we put all of this to the side, however, what is clear is that even ideally, Hunneth's theory of recognition presupposes capitalist relations instead of putting them to the test, for it takes capitalist ideology, such as the notion that compensation ought to be based on achievement, at face value. It would go without saying that this has horribly distorting effects on the questions of normativity and praxis, for both are unduly circumscribed. Thus, to conclude, consider the introduction to the comprehensive research project that Hunneth has set for the Institute for Social Research, Paradoxes of Capitalist Modernization, in which he credits neoliberal capitalism with undeniable moral, legal, and material progress. As an initial matter, the very idea that capitalism is responsible for whatever moral, legal, and material progress that has taken place is at best trivially true, but in any non-trivial sense, simply wrong. In a trivial sense, it is true that whatever moral, legal, and material progress has taken place is due to capitalism, insofar as capitalism was the dominant order under which the progress took place. In my view, this is in keeping with Foucault's positivistic view that power is not repressive but productive, and that, among other things, it produces its own internal resistance. But in a non-trivial sense, this moral, legal, and material progress has arisen from the resistance of people who took themselves to be attacking either some aspect of capitalism or the capital system in its totality. And the only reason that moral and legal progress can be attributed to capitalism is that it was able to reconstitute itself as a condition of its own survival. It's not that these imperatives were all moral and legal imperatives that were already inherent in it. This should not be confused with the notion that normatively capitalism itself has a surplus of validity, as Hunneth contends, although the reason for this confusion is clear enough. Capitalism has frequently been successful in co-opting oppositional norms. Nevertheless, the sort of understanding that Hunneth promotes has negative consequences for both normativity and praxis. Put in more theoretical terms, Hunneth's position reflects a deep historicism, which at first blush beneficially cuts against Habermas's transcendentalism and in some sense constitutes a return to the historicism of the first generation. But crucially, the first generation's historicism did not telescope its object domain in the same fashion as Hunneth, and this can be made clear by recognizing the different ways in which they address the relationship between capitalism and empirical sociology. Indeed, what is arguably most distinctive about Hunneth's approach to critical theory is the way in which it emphasizes empirical sociology. But empirical sociology is susceptible to being used in a profoundly conservative way. Consider Adorno's depiction of a Russian intellectual who had proudly informed Adorno that sociology was a new discipline in the USSR. Adorno states, "He meant empirical sociology, the idea that this might have anything to do with the dogma of society that was approved as a state religion in his country no more occurred to him than the idea that Marx might have carried out public opinion surveys." Adorno's point here is that an overemphasis on the findings of empirical sociology tends to presuppose the larger social totality, which is to say, to turn it into an unquestioned dogma, and that a radical analysis, such as Marx's analysis of capitalism, does not merely rest content with registering the discontents of people within society as it finds them, but instead searches for the institutional grounds that points in the direction of an emancipatory ideal, which is the only way in which these contents can be overcome in a non-ideological fashion. Hunneth's version of critical theory, as well as Habermas's, failed to recognize this fact, and in some sense, both of them collapse into the very sort of positivity that the first generation critical theorists had diagnosed.